Welcome to Edward Resurrects History. Today, we're telling the complete history of Rome, from Iron Age huts on the Seven Hills to 1950. Using AI trained on historical imagery, we can now see these eras as they may have actually looked. Let's go back to the very beginning.
Rome is civilization! Rome is order! Rome is power! We are Rome! Roma! Woo! Woo! Woo!
Ancient beginnings. The site of Rome is not chosen for beauty. It is chosen for practicality. Where the Tiber River bends in a shallow Z-curve, roughly 30 kilometers from the Tyrrhenian Sea, the river can be forded at a natural island crossing. And on both banks, a cluster of volcanic hills rises from the surrounding marshes, offering defensible high ground above the floodplain. By around 1000 BC, small Iron Age communities are already scattered across these hills: the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline. They live in oval wattle and daub huts, keep pigs and cattle on the hillsides, bury their departed in simple cremation urns. Their world is small and unglamorous. Nothing about them on the surface suggests that this particular bend in this particular river will become the center of Western civilization. But the geography is decisive. The ford at the Tiber Island is the lowest reliable crossing point on the entire lower river. Every trade route moving along the western coast of Italy passes here. Salt merchants from the coast, shepherds driving livestock between mountain and lowland, grain traders from the surrounding plains, all of them converge at this single point. Kingdom era. The settlement that controls this crossing controls the commerce of central Italy. Around 625 BC, archaeological evidence confirms what Roman tradition also preserved in legend. The scattered hilltop villages begin to coalesce into something far more deliberate. The marshy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills is drained and paved. It becomes the Forum, the first public open space, a marketplace and assembly ground simultaneously. The city is taking shape. The people who shape this transformation most powerfully are not the Latin-speaking villagers of the hills, but their sophisticated northern neighbors, the Etruscans. By around 600 BC, Etruscan kings are ruling Rome. They bring urban planning, monumental temple architecture, the technique of writing adapted from Greek colonies in the south, and a concept of organized public space that the hill villages had never conceived. Under Etruscan kings, Rome gets its first proper drainage system, the Cloaca Maxima, a channel of remarkable engineering that still functions beneath the streets of modern Rome today, over 2,600 years after its construction. The Capitoline Temple rises. The city's sacred boundary is formally established. Roman tradition assigns the founding to April 21st, 753 BC, and the legendary twin brothers Romulus and Remus. But what archaeology confirms is simply that the transformation from scattered village to functioning city happens precisely in this era, shaped decisively by Etruscan hands. Then, in 509 BC, the Romans expel their last king. The story turns on an act of outrage, the violation of a noblewoman named Lucretia by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius. Lucretia tells her family what happened, then ends her own life. The aristocrat Lucius Junius Brutus rallies the noble families and drives the Tarquin dynasty permanently from Rome. Republic era. The Republic is born. 2 annually elected consuls replace the king. Power is to be shared, checked, balanced. The Romans are so determined never to return to one-man rule that the very word rex, king, becomes an insult that will still provoke riots 5 centuries later. But the republic the patricians build is not one the common people find particularly just. Power belongs entirely to the noble families who dominate the Senate. In 494 BC, the plebeians simply leave the city, marching out to the Sacred Mount and refusing to return until their demands are met. It is one of the earliest recorded general strikes in human history. The result is the creation of the tribunes of the people, magistrates whose persons are declared sacrosanct, capable of vetoing any action by any Roman official. Then, in 451 BC, Rome produces the 12 Tables, a written legal code displayed publicly in the Forum so that any citizen can read what the law actually says. It is the foundation of Roman law, and through Roman law, the foundation of virtually every legal system in the Western world today. The Republic is forged as much by catastrophe as by legislation. In July of 390 BC, a Gallic chieftain named Brennus defeats the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River and walks into an undefended Rome. The senators, too old to flee, seat themselves in their ivory chairs in the Forum in full official robes and simply wait. The Gauls, initially awed by these motionless, white-robed figures, eventually realize they are simply old men and cut them down. When the Roman commander attempts to ransom the city with gold and objects that the Gauls are using dishonest scales, Brennus throws his sword onto the scale and says simply, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. The Romans never forget the humiliation. Within a generation, they rebuild their walls in massive tufa stone blocks. They will not be taken from the outside again for 800 years. The expansion that follows is relentless. Rome defeats the Samnites in a grinding series of wars through the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC. In 312 BC, the censor Appius Claudius builds 2 monuments that define exactly what kind of civilization Rome intends to be. The Via Appia, the first of the great Roman roads, running straight and stone-paved from Rome to Capua, and the Aqua Appia, the first Roman aqueduct, carrying clean water into the city from the surrounding hills. Both projects speak to a civilization planning not for years, but for centuries. By 264 BC, Rome controls the entire Italian peninsula and is ready to reach beyond it. The 3 Punic Wars against Carthage reshape the Mediterranean world entirely. In the Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BC, Carthage's greatest general, Hannibal Barca, accomplishes something almost inconceivable. He leads an army including war elephants across the Alps in winter and descends into Italy. For 15 years, he operates on Roman soil, winning battle after battle. At the Battle of Cannae in August of 216 BC, he surrounds and annihilates a Roman army of roughly 80,000 men in a single afternoon. The greatest tactical encirclement in military history, still studied in military academies today. Rome loses perhaps a third of its citizen soldiers in one day. And yet, Rome does not negotiate. It raises new legions, fights on, slowly exhausts Carthage's capacity to resupply, and ultimately wins. In 146 BC, the same year Rome destroys the Greek city of Corinth, Carthage is razed to the ground. The Mediterranean is now a Roman sea. But victory produces its own poisons. Wealth floods into Rome from conquered territories. Senators and generals acquire vast estates worked by enslaved people captured in war, displacing the small farmers who had been the backbone of the Roman army. In 133 BC, a tribune named Tiberius Gracchus proposes redistributing public land to landless citizens. He is beaten to death by a mob of senators in the Forum, the first use of political violence in Roman public life. His brother Gaius attempts the same reforms 12 years later and also falls. The Republic's social contract is fracturing irreparably. Through the early 1st century BC, a succession of brilliant and ruthless commanders, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, leverage their armies for political power, each one pushing the Republic closer to breaking point. In 60 BC, 3 men carve up Rome between themselves: Julius Caesar, the most talented politician of his generation, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and Pompey, the most celebrated general of the age, the first triumvirate. It is the Republic's death sentence, though nobody knows it yet. Caesar takes command of the armies in Gaul in 58 BC. What follows over 8 years brings the whole of what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland under Roman control, with 2 expeditions reaching across the Channel into Britain. Caesar's own account, the Gallic Wars, written in prose so clean and precise it served as a Latin textbook for 2,000 years, tells the story with cool third-person detachment. Ancient sources suggest that roughly 1 million people are killed and another million enslaved across the entire campaign. Caesar returns to Rome famous, wealthy, and commanding the personal loyalty of 8 battle-hardened legions. The Senate orders him to disband his army and return as a private citizen. On the night of January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stands on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the boundary no Roman general is permitted to cross with his army. Crossing it is an act of war against the Roman state. He pauses for a long time. Then, alea iacta est, the die is cast. He crosses. The civil war is brief. Pompey flees to Greece, then Egypt, where he is murdered on the beach. Caesar follows, and in Alexandria meets the 21-year-old Queen Cleopatra, who, according to ancient sources, has herself smuggled into his chambers wrapped in a linen sack. Their alliance, personal and political, will shape the Eastern Mediterranean for another decade. By early 44 BC, Caesar is dictator in perpetuity. He is reforming the calendar. The Julian calendar, with its 365-day year and leap year correction, will govern the Western world until 1582 AD and still underlies our modern system. Then, the Ides of March, 23 wounds, the floor of Pompey's portico, and the men who believed they had restored the Republic discover, in the weeks that follow, that they have instead plunged Rome into a civil war far worse than anything Caesar himself had started. Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir Octavian outmaneuvers every rival over the next 13 years, including Mark Antony, whose alliance with Cleopatra ends at the naval battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC. 1 year later, Cleopatra ends her life in Alexandria. Octavian is now the sole master of Rome. He is careful never to call himself a king. He calls himself princeps, first citizen. In January of 27 BC, the Senate grants him the title Augustus, the revered one. Empire era. The Roman Empire begins. What follows is 2 centuries of relative stability known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Under Augustus and his successors, Rome grows to perhaps 1 million people, the largest urban center on Earth. 14 aqueducts pour water into the city at nearly 1 million cubic meters per day. 80,000 kilometers of roads stretch across 3 continents. A letter posted in Roman Britain reaches Roman Syria in weeks. A merchant in Carthage uses the same currency, the same weights, the same legal framework as a merchant in Antioch or Londinium. No civilization will match the scale of this integration for 15 centuries. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, fire breaks out in the Circus Maximus and burns for 9 days. When it dies, 2/3 of Rome is ash. Emperor Nero, who reportedly rushed back to Rome from his villa to organize relief efforts, is nonetheless blamed by popular tradition for playing his lyre while the city burned. No credible evidence supports this. But once a story captures the Roman imagination, it becomes more durable than stone. Nero rebuilds the city in broader, more fire-resistant form and begins his vast private palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a complex so enormous it covers 3 of Rome's hills. He ends his own life in a suburban villa in June of 68 AD, reportedly whispering, "What an artist dies with me." In August of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under meters of volcanic ash. The writer, Pliny the Younger, 17 years old, watching from across the Bay of Naples, writes 2 letters describing what he sees. They are the oldest surviving first-hand eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption in history. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, sails toward the disaster to help and to observe, and does not come back. Pompeii, preserved almost perfectly under its volcanic shroud, will not be excavated until the 18th century. And when it is, it becomes the most detailed window into ordinary Roman daily life that the ancient world has left us. The following year, in 80 AD, Emperor Titus inaugurates the Colosseum with 100 consecutive days of spectacle. It seats between 50 and 80,000 spectators. Its system of vaulted arches, concrete construction, and numbered exits influenced stadium design for 2,000 years. Every major sports arena built today is, in some structural sense, a descendant of this building. Under Emperor Trajan, ruling from 98 to 117 AD, the Roman Empire reaches its maximum territorial extent, stretching from Scotland in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube in the north to the Sahara in the south. No political entity in Western history has ever governed so much territory under a single administration. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, pulls back from Mesopotamia, fortifies the frontiers, and builds across northern Britain an 80-kilometer stone wall bearing his name, still standing nearly 2,000 years later. The philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, ruling from 161 to 180 AD, is perhaps the most famous of all Roman emperors in the modern world, not for his battles, but for his private journal, the Meditations, written in Greek during military campaigns on the Danube frontier and never intended for publication. It has been in continuous print since the Renaissance, currently available in over 50 translations. The man who commanded the largest army on earth spent his evenings writing notes to himself about accepting impermanence. In 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla extends Roman citizenship to virtually every free inhabitant of the empire, transforming millions of provincials into full Romans overnight in one of the most sweeping legal acts of the ancient world. Then, beginning around 235 AD, the empire tears itself apart in what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years during which at least 26 men claim the title of emperor, most falling to their own soldiers within a few years of taking power. Plagues strike, the frontiers buckle, the economy convulses. Emperor Diocletian, taking power in 284 AD, stabilizes the situation through sheer organizational force, dividing the empire administratively, reforming the currency, restructuring the army. but he also launches the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the empire's history, ordering churches demolished and scriptures burned across the empire in 303 AD. Within a decade, everything is reversed. On October 28, 312 AD, the general Constantine wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge just outside Rome and attributes his victory to the Christian God, crediting a vision of a cross with the words "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. The Edict of Milan follows in February of 313 AD, granting religious freedom throughout the empire and ending all persecution. Constantine then moves the empire's capital eastward entirely, founding Constantinople on May 11, 330 AD, a city designed from the start to be a new Rome built on 7 hills, organized around its own forum, senate, and hippodrome. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius declares Christianity the sole official religion of the Roman Empire. The gods of the Capitoline Temple, worshipped for 800 years, are finished. The 5th century brings catastrophes Roman writers had been predicting for decades. On August 24, 410 AD, Visigothic forces under King Alaric enter Rome through the Salarian Gate. For 3 days they sack the city, the first time Rome has fallen to an enemy in 800 years. The shock reverberates across the entire Roman world. 45 years later, in June of 455 AD, the Vandals arrive by sea and spend 14 days stripping Rome's public buildings of their accumulated treasures. Then, on September 4th, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposes the last Western emperor, a 16-year-old boy bearing with grim irony the names of both the city's legendary founder and its first emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He is not killed, merely pensioned off to a villa in Campania. The Western Roman Empire ends not with a battle, but with a letter of abdication. Middle Ages and Byzantium era. Rome does not die. It contracts, transforms, and continues. The population, which had reached perhaps 1 million at its peak, shrinks to perhaps 20,000 by the 6th century. Cattle graze in the Forum. Marble is stripped from monuments for lime. The Pantheon survives intact only because it is converted into a church in 609 AD, a decision that preserves one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history from the fate that consumed nearly everything around it. Rome's fate now becomes tied entirely to its bishop, the Pope, who becomes the city's de facto ruler as imperial authority evaporates. On Christmas Day of 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowns the Frankish king Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans inside St. Peter's Basilica, reaching backward to the imperial tradition and projecting it forward into medieval Europe in a single gesture. In 1084 AD, Norman mercenaries summoned to defend the Pope instead sack the city for 3 days, leaving entire neighborhoods in ruins. Between 1309 and 1377, the papacy abandons Rome entirely for Avignon in southern France, leaving the city to faction warfare among its great noble families. When Pope Martin V finally returns in 1420, he finds a city of perhaps 17,000 people, smaller than it had been under the Etruscan kings. Papal Rome and the Renaissance era. The rebuilding that follows transforms Rome once more. In 1506, the foundation stone of a new St. Peter's Basilica is laid, the old Constantinian Basilica demolished to make way for something vastly more ambitious. In 1508, a 33-year-old sculptor named Michelangelo lies on scaffolding 60 meters above the floor of the Sistine Chapel and begins painting the ceiling. 4 years later, in 1512, he climbs down. What he leaves above him is arguably the greatest single artistic achievement in Western history. On May 6, 1527, troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, many of them unpaid Lutheran mercenaries, storm Rome. For 8 months, the sack of Rome brings destruction not seen since the Vandals. The brilliant cultural moment that had produced Raphael, Michelangelo, and Bramante in a single generation is gone in a season of unpaid soldiers. The 17th century brings Rome's Baroque transformation. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, working across 5 decades, remakes the city's public spaces with theatrical virtuosity never equaled. His colonnade in front of St. Peter's, completed in 1667, throws 2 curved arms around the piazza like an embrace, 384 columns, 140 saints against the Roman sky. St. Peter's Basilica itself, completed in 1626, becomes the largest church on earth. In February of 1798, French revolutionary forces enter Rome and declare a Roman Republic, the first republic on Roman soil since 509 BC. Napoleon annexes Rome to the French Empire in 1808, declaring his infant son the King of Rome. But the French presence lasts only until 1814. Then, in the spring of 1849, a new Roman Republic is proclaimed under Giuseppe Mazzini and defended by Giuseppe Garibaldi's volunteers. 5 foreign armies besiege the city simultaneously. The Republic falls in July of 1849. Era of Kingdom of Italy. On September 20th, 1870, Italian troops breach the Aurelian walls at Porta Pia. Pope Pius IX orders his soldiers not to resist. Within hours, Rome is in Italian hands. On July 2nd, 1871, Rome becomes the capital of the unified Kingdom of Italy. For the first time since the fall of the Western Empire, a single Italian state exists with Rome at its center. On October 28, 1922, Benito Mussolini organizes a march on Rome by his fascist paramilitaries. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearful of civil conflict, invites Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini arrives not by marching but by overnight train from Milan and is appointed Prime Minister the following morning. Within 3 years, he has dismantled Italian democracy and made himself Il Duce. In February of 1929, he signs the Lateran Treaty with Pope Pius XI, creating the independent Vatican city-state of 44 hectares, the smallest recognized sovereign state on earth, in exchange for papal recognition of the Kingdom of Italy. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini declares war on France and Britain from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia. Within 3 years, the catastrophic miscalculation is fully apparent. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini is voted out of power by his own Grand Council and arrested the same evening. On June 4, 1944, American forces enter Rome, the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies. The Germans had declared it an open city, sparing it from bombardment. Michelangelo's Sistine chapel ceiling is intact. Bernini's colonnade is intact. The Pantheon, nearly 2,000 years old, is intact. Modern Italian Republic era. On June 2, 1946, Italians vote to become a republic. The House of Savoy goes into exile. On January 1, 1948, the new Italian constitution comes into force, written by former partisans, priests, communists, and Christian Democrats, arguing in the same city where the Roman Senate once debated the fate of the ancient world. In 1950, Pope Pius XII declares a holy year. Millions of pilgrims arrive from every inhabited continent. They cross the Tiber on bridges that have carried feet across this same river for 2,000 years. They throw coins into fountains fed by aqueducts running since before the birth of Christ. They stand in the Forum and look at columns of temples to gods nobody has worshipped in 15 centuries. And they feel it, the particular gravity of a place so continuously at the center of Western history that its ruins are not ruins at all, but a living conversation between everything that has ever passed and everything still to come. Rome does not simply have a history. Rome is the history of how the world we live in was made. If this journey through the eternal city moved you the way it moves me every time I return to it, there is one thing I ask, something no emperor, no Gaul, no Vandal, no fascist, and no Allied bomb managed to stop this city from doing. And that is enduring. Hit that subscribe button and become part of this channel's own small piece of history. I'm Edward, and I want to know, what historical event should I resurrect next? Let me know in the comments.